The silent passenger. It was a cold winter night when I boarded the last train from Berlin to Munich. The temperature outside had dropped to near freezing, and the chill seeped into the carriages, despite the train's heating system. As I entered the station, I noticed how nearly deserted it was. The clock on the wall told me it was already past midnight, and the night air was thick with the quiet of a city falling into slumber. The last train to Munich, as I understood it, was always sparsely populated, and tonight was no different. I had just come off a long day of meetings and thought that the night's journey would provide a welcome opportunity to rest. The train car I boarded was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers here and there, most of whom were lost in their own worlds. I found a seat near the window and, after settling my things, leaned back against the cold plastic headrest. The train began to rumble softly as it started its journey southward, cutting through the stillness of the night with rhythmic precision. The flickering yellow lights above gave the cabin an almost melancholic atmosphere, like the fading remnants of a forgotten memory. I tried to settle in, pulling my coat tightly around me, but the combination of the cold and the eerie lighting made it hard to relax. Sleep would come, I thought, once the fatigue from the day caught up with me. The hum of the train and the passing landscape outside eventually began to lull me into a half-drowsy state, my mind wandering from one thought to the next. Then, as the train barreled along the tracks, I noticed something peculiar. A man had boarded the train at some point, though I hadn't seen him get on. He sat diagonally across from me, just far enough to be visible in the periphery of my vision. His posture was odd. His head bowed slightly, as though in deep thought or contemplation. His face was obscured in the shadows of his coat's collar, and the way he sat so still made it seem like he was part of the shadows themselves. I shifted my gaze briefly to confirm he was a real person, but the moment I looked directly at him, I could feel a cold shiver run down my spine. He had not moved, not an inch. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, it was late, and I was tired from the long day of travel. Perhaps he had simply settled into an odd position, or maybe the dim lighting was playing tricks on me. But as the minutes passed, the man's stillness became unnerving. I couldn't remember him getting on, nor could I recall any sound that accompanied his entrance. He had simply appeared, like a shadow slipping unnoticed into the train. I glanced at him again, this time more deliberately, hoping to discern something that would explain his unnerving presence. There was something in his posture, in the way he sat, that made me uneasy. He wasn't just a man lost in thought. No, it felt more like he was waiting for something, or perhaps someone. But who and why? The train sped through the desolate winter landscape outside, the only sound the clacking of the wheels on the tracks and the occasional rattle of the cabin. There was nothing but darkness beyond the windows, the occasional flicker of distant lights from small villages, the only signs of life in an otherwise lifeless scene. It felt as though we were moving through an endless stretch of nothingness, and yet, somehow, the stillness inside the cabin felt even heavier than the desolation outside. A minute passed, then another, but the man did not move. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the creeping sense of unease that had started to worm its way into my thoughts. It's nothing, I told myself. You're just tired. The lighting in here is playing tricks on your mind. But as if to confirm my growing suspicion, the train suddenly jerked. The sound of the engine sputtered for a moment before going quiet, and I felt a strange pressure in the air, as though something had shifted around us. A sharp screech followed, the train coming to an abrupt halt. The rattling of the train ceased, and all at once, the cabin was bathed in darkness. A cold draft rushed through the car, the whistling of the wind from outside cutting through the stillness like a knife. I was paralyzed for a moment, my heart racing in my chest. What the hell was going on? I couldn't see a thing, my eyes straining in the blackness. My breath fogged up in the air as I leaned forward, trying to make out any details. The train had stopped, but where were we? And why was it so quiet? And then, the sound came. Soft footsteps, a slow, deliberate pacing that echoed through the train. My pulse quickened as the footsteps drew nearer, but I couldn't move. It was as if I had lost the ability to speak, to breathe, to do anything but listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer. It sounded as though they were right outside my compartment, pacing back and forth in the corridor. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on with a jolt, casting a harsh yellow glow over the cabin. My eyes adjusted to the sudden brightness, and I quickly scanned my surroundings. The train was once again bathed in light, but there was something wrong. Something missing. The man in the black coat was gone. I blinked, my head spinning as I looked around. There was no sign of him. No sign of anyone who could have been sitting where he had been moments before. I could still feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, and a cold sweat formed on my brow. Had he gotten off the train? No, that didn't make sense. I hadn't heard the door open, and I would have noticed if anyone had passed by. Besides, we were in the middle of nowhere, far from any station or stop. I looked at the door to the next car. It was shut tight, the same as before. I scanned the rest of the cabin. Empty. There were no passengers standing up, no one moving about. There was only me, the stillness, and the faint echo of the wind outside. I tried to shake it off. It must have been my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. The lights had flickered, and I had been half asleep. The footsteps, the man. Everything was probably just a figment of my imagination. But as I stared at the empty seat where he had been, a sickening thought gnawed at my mind. What if it hadn't been? The train resumed its journey, a soft click of the wheels on the tracks, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. I couldn't focus, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. Who had that man been? And why had he vanished so suddenly, without a trace? When the train finally rolled into Munich several hours later, I staggered off, disoriented and exhausted. My mind buzzed with the strange events of the journey, but I pushed them aside as best I could. After all, it was late, I was tired, and I couldn't be sure of anything. I shrugged it off as a trick of the mind, something easily explained away by the fog of travel fatigue. But before I left the station, I found myself reporting the incident to one of the station authorities, just to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. The officer listened politely, his expression impassive. When I finished recounting the strange encounter, he nodded slowly, but there was no hint of concern in his voice. Fatigue can cause hallucinations, especially after a long day of travel, he said, his tone professional but dismissive. Nothing to worry about, sir. Probably just exhaustion. But as I left the station and stepped into the cold air of Munich's streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened on that train. Something inexplicable. Something that, no matter how I tried to rationalize it, refused to be explained away. To this day, I still wonder who or what that silent passenger was. The Crying Woman. It was a dreary, rainy night when I found myself boarding the train from Frankfurt to Hamburg. The kind of evening where the sky was thick with dark clouds, and the rain hammered the windows in an almost rhythmic, constant downpour. I had been travelling for hours already, and the last leg of the journey felt like it would never end. The train compartment was nearly empty, with only a few scattered passengers who, like me, seemed lost in their own worlds. As I settled into my seat by the window, I watched the rain smear the glass, distorting the blurred lights of the passing towns. The rhythmic hum of the train's wheels on the tracks was oddly soothing, and I found myself starting to relax, despite the fatigue that had begun to set in. The steady motion of the train seemed to lull me into a daze, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the rain and the train envelop me. It was in this half-dazed state that I first heard it. A faint sound, soft at first, like the distant sobbing of someone in distress. I opened my eyes and glanced around the empty compartment. It was late, and the train car was mostly empty, save for a few other passengers who, like me, appeared to be lost in their own thoughts. I couldn't imagine any of them making such a sound. At first, I thought it might be the wind. Perhaps the gusts from the storm outside were carrying a faint, eerie sound into the train. But the crying, no, it was too distinct. It was the unmistakable sound of a woman weeping, her sobs filled with such deep anguish that it sent a shiver down my spine. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore the feeling creeping into my chest. I convinced myself that it was nothing, that maybe I was just tired, or that the sound was coming from another compartment, or even from outside the train itself. I closed my eyes again, but the crying only grew louder, more insistent. It was as though it was right next to me, echoing through the air, pulling at my very soul. A surge of curiosity, and perhaps a little apprehension, compelled me to get up and investigate. I stood, casting one last look at the few passengers in my compartment. They all seemed oblivious, each lost in their own world, their heads buried in books, phones, or sleep. No one else seemed to hear the crying, or if they did, they were choosing to ignore it. I walked down the narrow aisle toward the next compartment. The train rattled as it sped through the storm, the occasional flicker of the overhead lights reminding me just how unsettling the situation was. The sobbing had grown louder as I walked, now unmistakable as a woman's cries of grief and despair. I felt a strange mix of sympathy and trepidation. Whoever was crying must have been in deep distress, and yet something about the sound felt unnatural. When I reached the door to the next compartment, I hesitated for a moment. I felt a sudden pang of unease, as though the very air around me had grown heavier. But I pushed the thought aside and opened the door, stepping into the next car. The compartment was almost entirely empty. A few passengers were scattered in the seats, but none of them seemed to be the source of the crying. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of the weeping grew louder, filling the space with an intensity that made it impossible to ignore. And then I saw her. In the corner of the compartment, sitting alone in one of the furthest seats, was a woman. She was dressed in a flowing white dress, her figure hunched over, her face buried in her hands. Her sobs echoed through the empty car, filling the air with a sense of unbearable sorrow. Her long, dark hair hung loosely around her face, adding to the ghostly appearance. It was as if she had materialized from the shadows of the train itself. I stood frozen for a moment, my gaze locked on her. The intensity of her crying was almost overwhelming, but I couldn't move. Something in me, some deep instinct, urged me to approach her. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped forward, unsure of what to say or do. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the situation, but it felt like I was caught in some strange dream. As I approached, I finally managed to speak, though my voice barely rose above a whisper over the noise of the train. "Are you okay?" I asked, my words sounding almost inadequate in the face of her obvious distress. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge my presence. Her sobbing continued, filling the compartment with a mournful, aching sound. I took another step closer, feeling a strange pull toward her. But even as I approached, something didn't feel right. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, as though the train itself had come to a halt, even though I could feel it moving beneath me. I tried again, speaking louder this time. "Are you all right? Can I help you?" Still, She didn't respond. Her crying persisted, but there was something about it that began to feel wrong. It wasn't just sorrow, it was something darker, something deeper. I stood there, unsure of what to do. My gaze never left her as I tried to make sense of what was happening. There were so many questions racing through my mind. Who was she? Why was she crying? Why was she here, alone in the middle of the night, dressed in white, in this empty compartment? Just as I was about to take another step forward, the train gave a sudden jolt, shaking violently for a split second. The lights flickered overhead, their harsh glow momentarily dimming. I flinched, blinking in the sudden change of light. And in that instant, the woman was gone. 1 second she was there, sitting in the corner, weeping with such intensity that it seemed impossible for her to have vanished. The next second, she was simply gone. Vanished. The seat was empty, her white dress nowhere to be seen. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around frantically, scanning the empty compartment. There was no sign of her, no hint of where she had gone. The other passengers remained oblivious, as though nothing had happened at all. I stepped back, my legs trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. Had I imagined it? Could it have been some kind of hallucination brought on by the exhaustion of the long journey? I couldn't bring myself to believe that, not after hearing her crying so clearly, not after seeing her so vividly in front of me. But there was no denying what had just happened. The woman in the white dress had been there, and then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. I stood frozen in place, my mind racing with questions and confusion. Had she been a ghost? Some kind of apparition? I couldn't explain it, but deep down I felt the weight of something unnatural in the air, something that clung to the very walls of the compartment. Trembling, I turned and made my way back to my seat, my heart still racing. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing, but the feeling of unease lingered. The crying had stopped, but the memory of it haunted me, echoing in my mind. The rest of the journey to Hamburg passed in a blur. I kept my eyes trained on the other passengers, making sure I wasn't seeing things again. The rain outside had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the storm in my mind raged on. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened in that compartment, something I couldn't fully understand. When I finally reached Hamburg and disembarked, I found myself still shaken by the events of the night. I considered telling someone about the crying woman, but I doubted they would believe me. After all, what could I say? That I had encountered a spirit on a late-night train? Who would believe such a thing? And yet I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. The woman in the white dress, the one who cried with such anguish, was real. She had been there, and she was gone. To this day, I can't shake the memory of her sobbing. And every time I board a train late at night, I can't help but wonder if I'll encounter her again. The crying woman. Who was she? What was she? I don't know. But the sorrow in her cries still echoes in my ears, a reminder of something beyond the realm of the living. The midnight passenger. It was well past midnight when I boarded the last train from Stuttgart to Cologne. The station was unusually quiet, the dim fluorescent lights casting an almost sterile glow over the platform. There were only a handful of passengers waiting for their respective trains, their weary faces illuminated by the dull, flickering lights overhead. They all seemed as tired as I felt, their exhaustion palpable in the chilly air of the nearly empty station. I had been travelling for what felt like an eternity, and the long day of meetings, travel, and stress had drained me. I was eager to finally settle into a seat and let the rhythmic motion of the train lull me into a much-needed sleep. As I scanned the platform for an open car, I found a nearly empty compartment near the rear of the train and made my way towards it. hoping for some peace and solitude. The train was far from crowded, with only a few other passengers scattered throughout the cars. Once I found my seat, I collapsed into it gratefully, adjusting my coat and bag before leaning back against the cold, hard seat. The interior of the compartment was dim, lit only by the soft, yellowish glow of the overhead lights, and the windows were covered with condensation from the cold air outside. The train started with a slight lurch, its engine coming to life as we began our journey toward Cologne. The motion of the train soon became soothing, the rhythmic clack of the wheels on the tracks mixing with the low hum of the engine. Outside, the landscape passed by in a blur of dark trees and fields, the occasional light from a distant farmhouse flickering like a distant star. It was the kind of journey where everything felt peaceful, almost dreamlike. I closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest before I reached Cologne. But just as I was about to drift off, something caught my attention. A figure at the far end of the compartment, tall, cloaked in darkness, standing perfectly still near the door. He was wearing a dark hat that cast a shadow over his face, and his posture was unnervingly rigid. I tried to ignore the man. It wasn't unusual for passengers to stand during the trip, especially if they were only looking for a moment of fresh air at the end of the car. But there was something about him that felt wrong. He wasn't moving at all, just standing there, as though he had frozen in place. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the situation, but I brushed it off. It was late, I was tired, and I didn't want to make a scene over something that could easily be explained away. I turned my gaze back to the window and tried to focus on the steady passing of the landscape outside. My eyelids grew heavy, the sound of the train's motion lulling me back into a drowsy state. However, despite my exhaustion, I couldn't completely ignore the feeling that lingered at the back of my mind. The presence of that man at the far end of the compartment remained with me. A quiet unease, settling over me like a weight I couldn't shake. Minutes turned into hours, it seemed. The train rumbled on, and I fought the urge to look back toward the man. Each time I glanced in his direction, I saw him standing there, motionless. His form was almost indistinct, swallowed by the darkness of the compartment, but I could still sense him. It was as if he were there, but not really there. Something wrong about his stillness, his unnatural quiet. My heart beat a little faster each time I looked, but I refused to give in to the rising anxiety. I closed my eyes again, telling myself that I was just imagining things. The train had become a lullaby, its gentle motion and the occasional flickering of the lights more than enough to coax me into a dreamlike state. But sleep was elusive, and each time I began to slip into unconsciousness, something seemed to pull me back. Then it happened. A cold gust of air washed over me, sending a shiver through my spine. It was unlike anything I had felt on the train before, unexpected and unsettling. I opened my eyes quickly, blinking against the sudden chill, and saw that the door to the compartment was wide open. My heart skipped a beat. The man was gone. I sat up straighter, my pulse quickening as I glanced toward the open door. The cold breeze that had brushed against my face seemed to come from the corridor outside, but the door had not been open before. It was as if it had been flung open in an instant. My mind raced as I stood and made my way to the door. I stepped into the narrow corridor, looking in both directions. The train was still moving at full speed, and there was no way someone could have exited the compartment without me noticing. But the corridor was empty. No one was there. No one could have possibly passed through. A growing sense of dread clawed at my chest, the air now thick with an unease I couldn't explain. The man, he hadn't exited through the door. He hadn't passed me. Where had he gone? I walked the length of the train car, peering through each compartment as I went, but all I found was more empty seats and dimly lit spaces. I felt foolish for even thinking of going any further. After all, If there had been anyone standing there, they were long gone. But the nagging question, the feeling that something wasn't right, lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow that wouldn't leave. With my breath coming in shallow bursts, I returned to my compartment and sat back down, trying to calm myself. I had to rationalize this. There had to be some logical explanation, some reasonable reason why I felt so unnerved. Maybe the man had slipped past me while I wasn't paying attention, or maybe he had moved to another part of the train. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing in my exhausted state. But as I sat there, my mind kept returning to that same nagging thought. What if it wasn't real? The train continued its journey, the rhythmic sounds of the wheels on the tracks a constant background to my racing thoughts. I tried to push the unsettling encounter from my mind, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that something or someone had been with me in that compartment. And now, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. When the train finally pulled into the Cologne station hours later, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The fog of unease that had clouded my thoughts seemed to lift as I made my way out of the train. But as I exited the car, something made me stop. My heart raced again as I remembered the strange incident, and a sudden need to understand what had happened overcame me. I approached the conductor, who was standing near the exit. He was busy checking tickets, but I hesitated before speaking up. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "I need to ask you something. There was a man on the train. He was standing at the far end of my compartment. He wasn't moving, and when I looked again, he was gone. Can you tell me who he was?" The conductor gave me a curious look, his brow furrowing slightly as though he were processing my words. He stood there for a moment, and then his expression shifted. Something almost unreadable passed over his face. "You're not the first person to report seeing him," the conductor said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "That man has been haunting this route for years. He shows up at random times, always around midnight, always in the same spot, standing motionless. And then, without warning, he vanishes. No one knows who he is or why he's here. But he's been a part of this train's history for as long as anyone can remember." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he had said. My breath caught in my throat and my stomach turned. Had I really encountered a ghost? Was it possible that the man I had seen standing there had been something not entirely human? The conductor, seemingly noticing my shock, gave me a sympathetic look. "It's unsettling, I know. But you're not alone in this. Many others have reported seeing him. If you ride this route long enough, you'll likely meet him too." I didn't know what to say. I stood there, my thoughts swirling in disbelief. Could I have truly encountered something supernatural? The fear that had gripped me in the compartment now seemed to make a sickening kind of sense. As I left the train station and stepped into the cool night air of Cologne, I couldn't shake the image of that man, tall, motionless, with his hat casting a shadow over his face. I couldn't understand why he had been there, or why he had disappeared without a trace. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never forget my encounter with the midnight passenger. And now, every time I board a late train, I'll be looking out for him, wondering if he'll be waiting for me in the darkness.